April 26, 1986. Moscow, the Kremlin, the office complex of the Central Committee of the Communist Party, shortly after 11 o'clock at night. The telephone call that came through to the duty officer carried information that seemed simultaneously catastrophic and impossible. A report from Ukraine stating that there had been an explosion at the Chernobyl Nuclear Power Plant, that a fire was burning, that radiation levels were elevated, but that the reactor itself was intact and the situation was under control. The words were reassuring in their substance, but alarming in their very existence, because nuclear power plants were not supposed to explode, and fires at reactor facilities represented exactly the kind of industrial disaster that Soviet propaganda insisted could only happen in the decaying capitalist West, not in the scientifically advanced Soviet Union, where nuclear energy symbolized the triumph of socialist planning over capitalist chaos. By midnight, a crisis management structure was beginning to coalesce in Moscow, with senior officials being called from their apartments and dachas, with telephone calls going back and forth between the Kremlin and Pripyat, the city built to house Chernobyl's workers, and with the growing recognition that something serious had occurred, even if the initial reports suggested the situation was manageable. Boris Sherbina, a 63-year-old deputy chairman of the Council of Ministers, whose responsibilities included the energy sector, was designated to lead the government commission that would go to Chernobyl to assess the situation and coordinate the response. He was a lifelong Communist Party bureaucrat, trained as a construction engineer who had risen through the Soviet system by demonstrating absolute loyalty, organizational competence, and the ability to deliver results that leadership demanded regardless of the actual difficulties involved. Sherbina represented a particular type of Soviet official, the practical administrator who was less interested in ideological purity than in solving concrete problems, who understood that Soviet industrial production required cutting corners and accepting risks that safety regulations theoretically prohibited, and who had learned to navigate between official procedures and actual practice in ways that kept projects moving forward while maintaining the fiction that everything was being done according to proper protocols. He had overseen major construction projects, had managed industrial sectors, and had developed a reputation for toughness and decisiveness that made him the obvious choice to handle a crisis that required coordinating multiple agencies and imposing order on what initial reports suggested was a confused local response. But nothing in Sherbina's background had prepared him for what he would encounter at Chernobyl, and the gap between his assumptions about how industrial accidents should be managed and the reality of a nuclear catastrophe that was unlike anything humanity had previously experienced would become increasingly and terrifyingly apparent as the hours passed. He boarded the special government aircraft that would fly him and other commission members to Ukraine in the early morning hours of April the 27th, carrying briefing materials that described a serious but contained situation, expecting to spend perhaps a day or two at the site ensuring that proper procedures were being followed, and having no concept that he was flying toward an event that would help destroy the Soviet Union, and that would expose the fundamental dysfunctions of the system he had served his entire adult life. The initial reports that reached Moscow in the hours after the explosion at 1:23 a.m. on April the 26th had been filtered through multiple layers of Soviet bureaucracy, each layer adding reassurance and removing alarming details in accordance with the unwritten rules that governed how bad news was communicated upward through the system. The plant operators who survived the initial explosion had been trained to believe that a catastrophic reactor failure was impossible, that Soviet RBMK reactors were so brilliantly designed that the kind of core meltdown Americans feared at their inferior power plants simply could not occur in the USSR. When they saw evidence contradicting this belief, when they observed that the reactor hall had been destroyed, that graphite from the reactor core was scattered around the facility, that radiation levels were thousands of times higher than normal, they initially refused to accept what they were seeing, continuing to insist that the reactor was intact because the alternative was literally inconceivable within their understanding of Soviet nuclear technology. This cognitive dissonance had been transmitted upward through the reporting chain, with each level of authority hearing conflicting information and choosing to believe the reports that aligned with ideological certainty about Soviet technological superiority rather than the evidence suggesting unprecedented catastrophe. The local party officials in Pripyat had been told the reactor was intact, had accepted this reassurance despite visible fire and elevated radiation, and had made decisions about evacuation and public information based on the assumption that the situation was serious but not catastrophic. The Republican authorities in Kiev had received similarly filtered reports, had passed them on to Moscow with additional reassurance added, and had focused their initial response on avoiding panic and maintaining public confidence in nuclear power rather than on protecting the population from radiation exposure they did not believe was occurring. When Sherbina's aircraft landed at a military airfield near Kiev in the morning of April the 27th, he was still operating under the assumption that this was primarily an organizational challenge, that the problem was one of coordinating an emergency response and ensuring that local officials were following proper procedures, and that his role was to impose order and discipline on a situation that had gotten somewhat out of hand, but that was fundamentally manageable. The drive from Kiev to Pripyat, about 90 minutes through the Ukrainian countryside in spring bloom, did nothing to challenge this assumption. The villages they passed looked normal. Farmers were working in fields, and there was no visible evidence of the catastrophe that had occurred fewer than 30 hours earlier. The first indication that something was profoundly wrong came when they approached Pripyat and Sherbina's dosimeter, the radiation detection device that all commission members had been issued, began showing readings far higher than the background radiation that should have been present. The device's needle was moving into ranges that indicated dangerous exposure levels, not in the immediate vicinity of the reactor, but kilometers away in areas where civilians were still going about their normal lives. Sherbina looked at the dosimeter with growing confusion, checked it against others to ensure it was not malfunctioning, and felt the first stirrings of genuine alarm as he realized that the situation might be far worse than Moscow had been told. The meeting with plant management and local officials that followed was the moment when the carefully constructed fiction of a contained accident began to collapse into recognition of catastrophe. Sherbina demanded clear answers about the reactor's status, about radiation levels, and about what measures were being taken to protect the population. The responses he received were contradictory, evasive, and increasingly alarming. Some officials continued to insist the reactor was intact, while simultaneously describing damage that made no sense if the reactor was actually intact. The radiation measurements being reported varied by orders of magnitude depending on who was asked and where measurements were taken. And the discussions about evacuating Pripyat's 50,000 residents revealed that this obviously necessary step had not been implemented because local officials had been waiting for authorization from higher authority rather than taking responsibility for a decision that would acknowledge the severity of the situation. The person who finally broke through the bureaucratic denial was Valery Legasov, a 49-year-old nuclear physicist and first deputy director of the Kurchatov Institute of Atomic Energy, who had been added to the government commission specifically to provide technical expertise. Legasov had initially shared the general assumption that Soviet reactors were safe and that whatever had happened at Chernobyl must have resulted from operator error or equipment failure rather than fundamental design problems. But as he reviewed the technical data, interviewed plant personnel, and examined the physical evidence, he reached a conclusion that contradicted everything Soviet nuclear scientists had been taught to believe. The reactor core had been completely destroyed in the initial explosion. It was now exposed to the atmosphere and burning, and massive quantities of radioactive material were being released into the environment with every hour that passed. Legasov's statement to the commission, delivered in his office in Pripyat in the afternoon of April the 27th, represented the moment when Soviet officials confronted the reality that their initial assessments had been catastrophically wrong, that they were dealing with an event unprecedented in the history of nuclear power, and that tens of thousands of people had already been exposed to dangerous radiation, while officials had been reassuring themselves that the situation was under control. He explained that the graphite moderator from the reactor core was burning at extremely high temperatures, that this fire was lifting radioactive particles high into the atmosphere where winds were carrying them across Ukraine and Belarus and potentially into Europe, and that the radiation release would continue until either the fire burned itself out or some method was found to extinguish it and contain the damaged core. The silence that followed Legasov's explanation was the silence of cognitive frameworks collapsing, of men realizing that they were confronting something their training and ideology had insisted was impossible, and of the dawning recognition that their decisions over the past day and a half had been based on fundamentally incorrect understanding of what had happened. Sherbina, whose entire career had been built on solving problems through organizational discipline and force of will, suddenly understood that he was dealing with a challenge that could not be overcome through traditional Soviet methods, that radiation was invisible and implacable and indifferent to party authority, and that every minute of delay was potentially causing harm to populations that depended on his judgment. His response revealed both the strengths and limitations of Soviet crisis management. He immediately ordered the evacuation of Pripyat, cutting through bureaucratic resistance with authority that came from his position and from his evident fury that this obviously necessary step had been delayed. Within hours, buses were being assembled from across Ukraine, and by the afternoon of April 27th, the evacuation began, with residents being told they were leaving temporarily and would return within a few days, a lie designed to prevent panic. But that meant people left without adequate possessions and with no understanding of the permanent loss they were experiencing. Simultaneously, Sherbina began organizing the emergency response measures that Legasov and other scientists said were necessary to contain the disaster. Military helicopters would drop sand, clay, lead, and other materials onto the burning reactor to smother the fire and absorb radiation. Miners would be brought in to dig a tunnel under the reactor to install a cooling system that would prevent the melted fuel from burning through the concrete pad and into the groundwater. Soldiers and plant workers would be sent into the highly radioactive facility to perform tasks necessary for stabilization, receiving doses of radiation in minutes that exceeded annual safety limits but that were deemed necessary to prevent even greater catastrophe. The military commander who would implement much of this response was General Nikolai Antoshkin, commander of the 17th Air Army, who was ordered to organize the helicopter operations that would drop thousands of tons of material onto the exposed reactor core. Antoshkin was a professional military officer, a helicopter pilot who had served in Afghanistan and who understood the capabilities and limitations of military aviation. When he was briefed on what was required, flying helicopters directly over an exposed nuclear reactor core, hovering while crew members manually dumped loads of sand and lead into the burning reactor, repeating this hundreds of times despite radiation exposure that would accumulate with each flight. His first reaction was that he was being ordered to conduct a suicide mission that would kill his pilots while accomplishing little. The conversation between Antoshkin and Sherbina about the helicopter operations captured the fundamental tension of the Chernobyl response. The gap between what scientists said was necessary and what was humanly possible, between the imperative to act quickly and the certainty that action would cause terrible harm to the people implementing it, and between the Soviet system's traditional reliance on human sacrifice to overcome material limitations and the recognition that this particular crisis required technical solutions rather than mere heroism. Antoshkin said bluntly that he could organize the flights, but that the radiation exposure would likely be fatal for many pilots, that the helicopter operations might not even be effective at smothering the reactor fire, and that leadership needed to understand that they were ordering men to die in an operation whose success was uncertain. Sherbina's response was harsh and revealing. He said that the pilots would fly because that was what was required, that concerns about individual exposure were secondary to preventing radiation from contaminating half of Europe, and that the Soviet Union had defeated fascism through sacrifice and would defeat this crisis through the same method. The exchange was characteristic of how Soviet authority operated, demanding obedience and sacrifice while dismissing concerns about human costs as weakness or disloyalty. But it also reflected a grim reality. There was no safe way to contain the burning reactor, no method that would not require exposing people to dangerous radiation, and no alternative to using human beings to implement measures that in a better designed system might have been automated or remotely controlled. The RBMK reactor design that had failed so catastrophically had been chosen partly because it was cheaper than alternatives with more robust containment structures. And now, that cost-saving decision was being paid for by the liquidators who would be sent into the radioactive ruins. The helicopter operations began on April the 27th and continued for days, with pilots flying up to 30 sorties daily through air so contaminated that their aircraft instruments were affected by radiation. The crews rigged their helicopters with lead sheeting on the floors to provide minimal protection, wore dosimeters that quickly exceeded safe exposure levels, and developed informal rotation systems to spread the radiation exposure among more personnel, rather than allowing a few pilots to absorb potentially lethal doses. They flew in conditions where the heat from the burning reactor created turbulence that made hovering difficult, where radiation effects on human physiology caused nausea and disorientation that impaired piloting ability, and where the knowledge that they were being poisoned with every flight required psychological compartmentalization that left many permanently traumatized. The ground-level operations were even more horrific. The roof of the turbine hall adjacent to the destroyed reactor was covered with chunks of graphite from the reactor core, each piece intensely radioactive, emitting radiation at levels that would deliver fatal doses within minutes of exposure. These materials had to be removed before they could burn through the roof and start fires that would spread contamination. Robots were sent to perform this task, but the intense radiation caused their electronics to fail within minutes. The solution was to use human beings, soldiers, and plant workers who were sent onto the roof in shifts of 90 seconds or less, just long enough to shovel a few pieces of graphite off the edge before their exposure reached dangerous levels and they had to retreat. These biorobots, as they became known, worked in a nightmare landscape where visibility was obscured by smoke and steam, where the graphite pieces they were handling were so radioactive that being near them was life-threatening, and where the dosimeters they carried clicked so rapidly that the sound became a continuous scream. They wore lead aprons that provided minimal protection, operated in conditions where summer heat combined with heavy protective gear caused heat exhaustion, and knew that they were sacrificing their long-term health to prevent catastrophe. The Soviet system had reduced them to expendable biological components in a technological disaster, using human bodies to accomplish tasks that proper reactor design should have made unnecessary. The psychological impact on officials managing the crisis deepened as the scale of the disaster became clearer. In the first days after the explosion, there had been hope that the situation could be stabilized quickly, that the immediate danger could be contained, and that the long-term consequences would be manageable. But as radiation monitoring expanded, it became apparent that contamination extended hundreds of kilometers from Chernobyl, that agricultural land across Ukraine and Belarus was contaminated with radioactive cesium and strontium that would make it dangerous for decades, and that the ultimate human toll from cancer and other radiation-induced illnesses would likely extend into thousands or tens of thousands of additional deaths beyond the immediate casualties. Shabina's own exposure to radiation during his repeated visits to the site would eventually contribute to his death from leukemia 5 years later. Legasov, who spent months at Chernobyl, and who subsequently became the Soviet Union's primary spokesperson explaining the disaster to international audiences, would commit suicide in 1988, driven partly by radiation-induced illness and partly by anguish over his role in defending Soviet nuclear technology despite recognizing its fundamental flaws. Antoshkin would survive, but would carry lifelong health problems from his radiation exposure, as would most of the helicopter pilots who flew the missions over the burning reactor. The broader consequences for the Soviet Union extended far beyond the immediate crisis management. The disaster occurred during Mikhail Gorbachev's campaign for glasnost, for openness and transparency in Soviet society, and the government's handling of Chernobyl demonstrated the fundamental contradiction between this proclaimed openness and the Soviet system's instinctive secrecy. Initial reports to the Soviet public minimized the accident's severity. Radiation readings were classified as state secrets, and the true extent of contamination was concealed from populations living in affected areas. When Swedish monitoring stations detected the radiation cloud passing over Scandinavia and demanded explanations, the Soviet government was forced to acknowledge the accident but continued to downplay its severity. This pattern of denial and deception destroyed remaining public trust in Soviet institutions among precisely the population, educated urban professionals, whose support was essential for Gorbachev's reform program. If the government lied about something as serious as nuclear disaster, if it exposed its own citizens to dangerous radiation rather than admitting problems, if it valued propaganda and secrecy more than public safety, then how could any official statement be trusted? Chernobyl became a catalyst for the collapse of Soviet legitimacy, demonstrating that the system's fundamental dysfunctions were not merely economic or political, but extended to matters of physical survival. The technical investigation that followed revealed that the disaster had resulted from a combination of operator errors and fundamental design flaws in the RBMK reactor that Soviet scientists had known about but had failed to correct because doing so would have required acknowledging that Soviet nuclear technology was flawed. The reactor had a positive void coefficient, meaning that under certain conditions, loss of cooling water could lead to power increases, rather than the shutdown that safety required. This counterintuitive characteristic, combined with inadequate control systems and operators who had been trained that catastrophic failure was impossible, had created conditions where a safety test triggered runaway reaction that literally blew the reactor apart. The alternative scenarios that might have prevented or mitigated the disaster are both technically and systemically complex. If the reactor design had included the robust containment structure that Western reactors featured, the explosion might have been contained and radiation release minimized. If Soviet nuclear safety culture had prioritized transparency and learning from near misses rather than concealing problems to maintain the fiction of technological superiority, the design flaws might have been identified and corrected before catastrophic failure occurred. If the operators conducting the test had been properly trained and had not been pressured to complete the test. Despite safety concerns, the specific sequence of events leading to the explosion might have been avoided. But all these alternatives would have required a fundamentally different Soviet system, one that valued safety over production targets, that tolerated acknowledgement of failures and uncertainties, and that placed human welfare above ideological claims about socialist technological superiority. The Chernobyl disaster was not merely a nuclear accident, but rather the inevitable result of a system that systematically prioritized political considerations over technical reality, that punished honesty and rewarded those who told leadership what it wanted to hear, and that had lost the capacity for self-correction that functional institutions require. For Sherbina, Legasov, and Toshkin, and the other officials who managed the crisis response, Chernobyl represented a moment of devastating clarity about the system they had served and the costs it imposed on ordinary people. They had been trained to believe in Soviet technological prowess and socialist planning superiority, had built careers on implementing projects that advanced Soviet power and prestige, and had internalized the assumption that personal sacrifice for collective goals was the highest form of human achievement. Chernobyl forced them to confront the reality that their system was fundamentally broken, that it created disasters through institutional dysfunction and then compounded them through secrecy and denial, and that the human costs of its failures were being borne by people who had no voice in the decisions that endangered them. The philosophical implications extend to fundamental questions about how technological systems interact with political structures, about the costs of authoritarian decision-making in complex technical domains, and about the human tendency to believe what ideology or training teaches rather than what evidence reveals. The Soviet commanders at Chernobyl were not stupid or incompetent. They were intelligent, experienced people operating within a system that systematically distorted information, punished honesty, and prioritized political considerations over safety. Their initial failure to recognize the disaster's scale and their subsequent struggle to organize effective response revealed not personal inadequacy, but rather institutional pathology that made rational crisis management nearly impossible. The lesson that Chernobyl taught, at a cost measured in thousands of lives and vast territories rendered uninhabitable, was that complex technological systems require institutional honesty and transparency to operate safely. That authoritarian systems that suppress uncomfortable information will eventually face catastrophic failures they cannot manage, and that the price of choosing ideology over reality is ultimately paid by innocent people who had no role in making the decisions that endangered them. For the Soviet Union, Chernobyl accelerated the terminal crisis of legitimacy that would culminate in the system's collapse, demonstrating that a superpower's military might and ideological certainty meant nothing when confronting invisible radiation that neither respected authority nor responded to propaganda.